in Los Angeles. Can we make some noise for him, please?
I'm gonna get crazy here. Do this. Is that gonna work for us? Yes? Okay, awesome. So thank you, Rachel, for having me here. Thank you for the warm introduction. I'm going to try not to sneeze my way through the next half hour. So if I duck behind the podium and start sobbing and sneezing repeatedly, just don't be alarmed. It'll be over momentarily. So first of all, I want to thank Rachel for putting this together and having me out. In one of the myriad interviews that Rachel has given on what we're all doing here, she said something which really jumped out to me and which is more or less what I want to talk about. She said, why instead? Well, to create a new market based on innovation and quality rather than social contracts and ass kissing. Mwah. Okay, so what's bad about social contracts and ass kissing? Because social is good. That's like a good thing. Social things are good. Kissing is good. Some of you may really like asses and contracts, but that's like another talk. I'm not going to give that talk. So what I want to talk to you about is just really the three sentences that you can find in my talk description. I'm from a political theory background. We do a lot of philosophy and a lot of close reading, and so it's not unusual to spend substantial chunks of time talking about very few sentences. The trick is to make it interesting. So here we go. How can renegades thrive in a world where competition so often fosters conformity, combat, or both? I don't know how many of you think of yourselves personally as renegades. Maybe some of you, maybe you're not sure. That's fine. What do I mean by renegades? Last time I was in this neighborhood here in the Arts District, I was going to a morning party. I was going to my first morning party. Started at about 6:30 in the morning. You're supposed to dress appropriately. Some people showed up in like leopard print onesies, and it was great. So I was walking over from my apartment in Little Tokyo, and I had on these boots and like a vest with a hoodie attached and a cowboy hat and some emoji pajamas that I picked up recently. I was taking my emoji pajamas out for a drive. So I'm walking down the street, and I walked past that gas station on like 5th and Alameda. And there's a fine, upstanding citizen pumping his gas at the gas station. And, it's early, it's 6:30, sun's just come up, and he sees me walk by, and he sort of, yo, bro, are those your pajamas? And I look at him, and I say, fuck yes, because I'm a renegade. No, I say, yeah, I'm going to a party. And I kept walking. And I thought, that was like not very forceful, did I really own it? When I just said, I'm going to a party, man, rather than claiming my renegade stature. But I didn't feel so bad about it because, I realized like weakness and vulnerability are two different things. You can be very vulnerable while also being quite strong. And you can be quite weak without really presenting vulnerability. And so one of the things that I want to just have in our minds as we go forward is that if you do think of yourself as a renegade or find yourself in a position where you're very resistant to choosing teams or being pigeonholed or having to say like, well, if I'm for this, I'm against that, and if I'm against that, then I'm for this. That strikes people as weakness sometimes. I would encourage us to think that there's something deeper there going on, something that pertains more to vulnerability, to the ability to open yourself up to being challenged, to being hurt, to being changed, to being affected. And that's not a mark of weakness. Renegades aren't introverts, I don't think. One of the many sort of binaries that we are encouraged to choose from is, well, you're an introvert or you're an extrovert. Or maybe you're an extroverted introvert. Or maybe you're an introverted extrovert. So you've got these categories, and it's easy to put people into them, and especially when, you're trying to get clicks on the internet. And you say, well, here are like 65 things that mean you're an introvert. And then everyone can sort of find some shelter or repose in this little category. That's not what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of renegades. The truth is, I think, and this goes back, pretty far to, guys like Friedrich Nietzsche and guys like Alexis de Tocqueville, all the way back to St. Augustine. We all oscillate, you know? We have moments of intense outwardness where we're throwing ourselves into the world. No matter what the consequence, sometimes no matter what the price. We're compelled to get out of ourselves, get out of our skin, get out of our sort of interior world, push out. But at the same time, you know, we can't be out in the world thrusting forward 24 hours a day. We've got another part of our human makeup that draws us inward and makes us brood, and makes us isolate, and makes us feel lonely, and makes us sort of stew in our own juices. And the fact that it's in the human condition, it's in the human predicament to do this oscillation, is something that we should just embrace, I think. And yeah, it can be tiring, and it can be exhausting, and it can be disorienting. But we're not going to find the sort of rest in these binary categories, in these teams that we're so often invited to become members of. Renegades are not narcissists, you know? This is not about having an ego trip and saying, you know, well, I'm such a sovereign individual that I don't need to be with anyone, you know? I don't have a label, I don't have a name, I'm just this sort of being that's disconnected from everyone. You know, Aristotle said that someone who's not a member of a city is either a beast or a god, and he was kind of pointing in that direction where if you let your sort of ego captivate you, then you can break, you know, the real social links with other human beings, the relationality with your fellow human beings. That is, you know, that is not the same as team membership. Relationality is not the same as, you know, that kind of what seems to us to be like tribal loyalty, and I'll talk a little bit more about how it's not really that tribal in a minute. I would suggest to you that renegades, unlike narcissists, are okay with death. They're not afraid of death. They're okay even with something like the death of the self, as we would tend to think of the self. If you don't know how to die, in the sense that every day that goes by you are getting closer to death, that's the bad news. The good news is that you can sort of live in a way where that isn't bad news, right? And that, I think, opens up renegades to the question of like how you can love. If you're marching toward death, you have a limited amount of time to love, but you have many possibilities within that framework. And sure enough, you know, I think when you start, if you spent another 3 hours sort of trying to unpack love and trying to explain what love is vulnerable, but it's not weak, much like us human beings can be. You know, love can really just sort of open yourself up and you put your heart out there, and sometimes it gets squashed, sometimes it gets stepped on, sometimes you get rejected or spurned or turned away or perhaps not annihilated, but it can feel that way. But you survive, as many of us know, and love, I think, is another touchstone for us to think of how to be vulnerable but not weak, and how not to conform. You know, there are a lot of pressures to conform, and there's competitive conformity. You know, Peter Thiel is like a pretty mainstream guy now, but if there's one thing that I think, you know, he leaves us with to think about pretty seriously, is how markets can allow competitive conformity to develop. You know, that's not the market's responsibility to take care of that. That's our responsibility to make sure that we're not drawn into this kind of obsessive competition to just marginally edge each other out at something that we're all doing. That is how, you know, how teams form in the bad sense, where you have, you know, competing groups that think of themselves as so different because, you know, well, they're on different teams. But when you look at what they're doing is almost exactly the same thing. That's not pro-social, right? That's like fairly antisocial. There's not going to be a lot of kissing between teams there, you know? It's going to be this kind of competitive race to edge people out at doing almost exactly what your supposed enemy is doing. That's, you know, that's pretty crazy, but that's what happens. And that's something that's reinforced in our education system all the time. I was just tweeting with a friend of mine, and he said, school normalizes and encourages competition. Not that competition is a bad word, right? But if your psychological framework is one way and on another, it can lead competition toward things that defeat or undermine the promise of competition. And he said, well, in real life, when you want to do something new and weird, then you trade people. You trade with people for stuff. That's the kind of model that doesn't get propagated in schools. That's not the kind of model that gets propagated in the media. Certainly not the kind of model that gets propagated in politics. These are all quote-unquote problems. There's a big vogue for problematizing. Where'd I go? Here I am. Big vogue for problematizing today. But oftentimes, it seems like when people problematize things, they don't make them more interesting. And, life is going to be problems one way or the other, so we may as well have interesting problems. So it's okay to find problems. It's okay to problematize things, as long as you're making them more interesting. If you're making them less interesting and just hardwiring them into that competitive framework where everyone ends up just fighting to conform, that I think is less interesting and more bad, right? I'm just going to read one more tweet here from my friend, because he's a smart guy. He just got hired by a large tech corporation. But he's, not thinking like a large tech corporation person, and there's always hope when that happens. Not a good life lesson, he said. Win by doing what everyone else does, only more fanatically and obsessively. Not a good life lesson. And that's right. And I don't think it's a complete accident that we had this conversation 5 minutes before I got up here to talk to you. Okay, so we've got sort of concepts of love and vulnerability and how renegades can look at navigating the world that they find themselves in without being sucked into this competitive conformity of team making. Saul Bellow wrote a book called The Adventures of Augie March. There's a quote from it, which I'm going to share with you. Nobody should be a mystery intentionally. Unintentionality is mysterious enough. Who we are is gonna be a mystery. And the harder we try to figure out who we are, the more we're going to be frustrated that the mystery doesn't end. But in fact, it's good news that the mystery doesn't end, because we can sort of bracket that question of, who am I? What's my identity? Those kinds of questions are the things that are pulling people into these kind of no-win, competitive, conformist team conflicts. Oh, I can't identify myself. I need to latch myself onto this group or that team. That's how I'm going to be able to orient myself in space, whether it's economic space, political space, moral space, psychological space. Rather than thinking about who we are, I think the lesson of love and vulnerability that isn't weak is to think about how we are. If you just set aside that nettlesome question of who I am, that question that someone like Hamlet spent a whole famous play struggling with and failing to come to grips with, then we can focus our attention on how we are choosing to be, right? Adverbs. And our language is not really well equipped to cash this out in a way that seems natural, right? So like if someone says, oh, hey, how are you today? Like a good answer in this framework would be like, I am generously. How are you? That sounds weird to us, right? But that's like the kind of mindset that's going to enable us to orient ourselves in social space without being sucked into what I feel and others feel is a pathological and just not a productive combination of tribal politics on the one hand and its sort of evil twin, which is this like enforced corporate togetherness on the other hand. And sure enough, since our culture is dominated by those things, we're then competing with each other to perfect them. So there's always another marginal innovation in making tribal politics more tribal. There's always another marginal innovation in making corporate togetherness more perfect. We're going to make the perfect corporate retreat, or we're going to ensure that, never before has an office been so HR compliant. Or, we're going to mobilize turnout for our party so that not a single potential voter stays home that day. We're going to micro-target the shit out of every American so that we crack the demographic code. And then it doesn't matter how many people are implacably opposed to our team as long as we beat them at the margin by that 0.1%, right? This is, disturbing to me. It's been disturbing to political theorists throughout history. It may be disturbing to you as well. And I think it's the sort of thing that, people who do seem to be renegades struggle with. It seems hard to overcome this massive system. So we've got competitive conformity at sort of this basic cultural level, and then we've got like professional casts of people who are trying to perfect it even further. So I don't know if you've had this experience, but it seems like increasingly everyone acts like a bad lawyer, when they're defending like their ideology or defending their team or defending their identity group, whatever it is, regardless of politics, regardless of sort of, what their fundamental priors are. The assumption is you and I can't really overcome our frameworks. We can't overcome the things about our identity that separate us. And so the best that I can do is just sort of avalanche you with information that's been filtered and presented in a way that puts my team in the best light and your team in the worst light. And so just like an attorney doesn't actually need to persuade, whether it's a jury or a judge, that they should collaborate on their enterprises, on what it is that they're spending their life force on. Instead, you can just get the other person to say, fine, I give up, you win. For now. But I will be back with better lawyers next time. And that's kind of the way our politics is working. And that's the way a lot of the fights on campus are working right now. People are being drawn into this bad lawyerly world. We're gonna compel you to assent. I'm gonna claim my rights, and you're gonna give them to me, regardless of whether you like me, love me, hate me, just wish I would go away. Also not very pro-social. So this is a window, I think, onto how, what's wrong with social contract run amok. When relationships are just viewed as contracts between hostile parties, compelling assent to some sort of balance of power that's always going to be renegotiated in fundamentally contested way, we're selling ourselves short. And we're squeezing out the kind of talent, the kind of commitment, the kind of generosity of spirit, and the kind of love that you get from people who are fundamentally uncomfortable with that kind of regime in social life, political life, economic life. So what happens if we embrace the idea that how we are is going to do a better job of giving us access to these kinds of pro-social relationships that lead to real and metaphorical kissing, right? How do we sort of experience that for ourselves in a way that's real to us and not just some abstract idea that we can go around beating people up in the name of like, well, everything's about justice and that's why I'm right. Or no, everything's about freedom and that's why I'm right. No, it's actually all about equality and that's why I'm right and you're wrong. How do you break out of that framework? There are a couple ways to do it, to experience this kind of in your own personal, immediate life. And I'm not the first person to sort of trot this example out. But it's one that works. I've done it, seen other people do it. It's fairly powerful. Just stand next to someone, about a foot away, like a reasonably uncomfortable distance, and just look them in the eye, and they look you in the eye. And you do this for about, it doesn't take long. It's 5 minutes, 4 minutes. And what starts happening is something that's at once strange, but also strangely familiar. You can even do this looking in a mirror. You can feel that kind of the boundary of your identity just start to fade into the background. You start to realize that when we think like, where is here? Here isn't like in my head for me. Here is there, you know. Where I am right now is where I am showing up for you. Here is there. And that's like a hard thing to make sense of conceptually unless you like experience it in practice, in reality. And then you go, wow, that's right. Like I'm actually not, you know, like somewhere in there. I'm where I show up for everyone else. And if I'm not showing up for everyone else, like, yeah, I don't know. Then where am I? If we are able to have those kinds of experiences, we can jump out of the pattern. We can recognize the pattern for what it is, where we do this oscillation thing, where we're either turning very much inward or very much outward. And in the anxiety of that swing back and forth, we get tired. We're looking for rest. We're looking for shelter. We're looking for security. You know, we live in a society where everything is about security. Why? Because everyone feels so damn insecure. Why do they feel so insecure? They're tired. They're tired of feeling like they're either just like in FOMO world, or where they're in like permanent competition with people who are increasingly interchangeable with them. You know, like, yeah, on balance, equality is a great thing. But when equality occurs to us as, you know, every day I feel like I'm more similar to everyone else around me, and so I've got to like be more obsessed than them. I've got to find that edge. I've got to be crazier than them. I've got to be more fixated than them. Even if it just means beating them by that 1%, because then that means like I'm going to get the prize, I'm going to get the status, I'm going to get the resources, and this person to my left, who's almost identical to me, is not. That's an exhausting way to live. And in that exhaustion, when teams come along and say, hey guys, you know, I know that it's really burdensome and your identity always feels like it's under attack and it seems like you can't stop moving without falling behind. Come be one of us. And then at least you can say like, well, I may be losing to team B, but at least I know that I'm on team A. If we can have those experiences where the boundary between here and there, between me and you, between us and them, is something that we can actually watch dissolve, even a little bit, even for a moment, then we can start accustoming ourselves to seeing how our brains take new information, new experiences, and match them up with the patterns that we've formed as we go back and forth in this endless oscillation. Through memory, through imitation. When we get new information, we just want to send it right into the lizard brain. I know what situation I'm in. I know how to process this. I know who to fight. I know who to run away from. All feeding back into competitive conformity and team making in the bad sense. If we do this, I think, and I've tried this out, seems to be working pretty well so far, what we uncover is that the self, what we think of as ourselves, is mostly just something we've sort of constructed, just something we put together in the hopes of making our lives livable. And it's a scary thing to think, I kind of just made up a self. It's kind of a combination of just old patterns and like ways that I see myself, I'm the kind of person who the mic always goes out on. It's just who I am. I'll never change that. I can't change that. It's just who I am. These are my issues, my baggage. Right? When you see that process happening, and you see it happening with other people and with yourself in a moment of vulnerability, a space of vulnerability, what you can realize is that no matter, what's happened to you or what is happening to you, that's not who you are. You always are already stuck with the freedom to choose how to be. Whatever the situation is that you're in, whatever group of people you're stuck with or wound up with, no matter how terrible or hopeless your circumstances seem to be, or how awesome and fruitful your circumstances seem to be, you are stuck with the responsibility to choose how to be. That's a powerful insight, but it also creates, a fairly intense moment. You can't pawn that off on other people. You can't pawn it off on teams. And you can't neglect it. Because if you do neglect it, then, there's a pattern or there's a team that's just ready for you. It is ready to pretend to solve that problem for you. But in fact, no. You always have the freedom to choose how to be, and if you take advantage of it, new creativity, new fertility, new productivity, you can transform markets, you can transform lives, you can transform relationships. The fact of the matter is that there are teams in the world, and they're probably not going to go away, at least for a while. We've got powerful human constitutive parts that make that temptation ever present, always strong. So even if you find yourself in a position where you feel like, well, yeah, I feel like a renegade, or I'm like aspirationally a renegade, but for now, I'm sort of like, I guess I feel like I kind of wound up on this team, or I kind of got pigeonholed in this way, or like, I can't just leap out of the circumstances I'm in. So yeah, so maybe you don't, have a choice right now about the team that you're on, or the team that you're perceived as being on. But you do always have the choice about how to be within that context. And that, I would suggest, is the way out of the trap. The way out of the trap of feeling like we're in a culture where everyone's becoming more similar in fundamental ways, even though superficially we're becoming different. Like, well, I'm health goth, so I'm different from you, right? Well, sort of, but not in the way that makes a difference for us psychologically, socially, culturally. So, this isn't a solution to a problem, it's an approach. And my hope and my intentionality here in talking about it with you is that if you do feel like you are living in renegade world, or if you do feel like the culture of teams and fake tribalism. Tribes are hierarchical groups that are like based on families. Like tribal politics isn't really tribal. It's something else. It's like pretend tribal. And if you feel, as I felt, that these problems are so immense and hard to get a grip on and dwarf us personally, then perhaps this way of looking at things, this way of trying to balance yourself out in a way that the culture oftentimes pushes us so hard toward not balancing ourselves out. If you look inside and realize, I don't need an identity in order to flourish, then that can begin to change. Maybe not instantly across all of society and all of the world, but in good time, which is time enough. Thanks.